All right, this quick tutorial is going to sort of walk you through and help you get your head around what the GeoHistogram is used for in a world history course. So the first thing that I like to point out with students is these colorful wavy lines, and I let them know that they represent all of recorded history. And you can see how there are, they sort of appear in this wave shape pattern. That's because we are putting all of history in this one tiny little diagram. So in the eras where fewer things happened, like closer to the bottom of the geohistogram, the waves are a little bit more. Whereas as we get closer to modern times, we've got more stuff recorded throughout history. You can see that, there's fewer waves overall. Now, this is the online version, and I recommend using the online version with students so that they can, in short bursts, using some of the activities in Giant so that you and they can both start to wrap your head around what you're seeing. The very first thing that I like to turn on is directions. So when I click on the West-East button, you can see that over by the purple, we're talking about the Western world. Over in the East, we're talking about the Eastern world. And I will go a little bit further and turn on labels. So the purple is everything that's happening in the Americas throughout all of human history. Blue is Europe, green is Africa, and so on down the line, all the way over to Oceania, which includes Australia and some of the islands out there. And then I also like to turn on the timeline so that you can get a sense of, okay, here's what I meant before. You see the waves are a little bit different. So 7000 BCE, we don't have a lot of recorded history. So we make these really, really early years smaller because not a lot of stuff is happening. And then as we get closer to Common Era or, AD, we have this line drawn almost down the center, and you can see that the waves get a little bit smaller. So 500 CE, more stuff happens between 500 and 1000, so we slowly start to expand this out a little bit more. Whenever I do geohistogram work in a class, what I like to do right off the bat is take everything off except just this portion of it. And I like to ask students how big they think the bubble that might represent the United States would be. So I would maybe even have students come up and, if you're projecting this on a smartboard, have them actually have 3 or 4 students volunteer, say, okay, we're going to take this purple column and I want you to draw a bubble that you think represents all of United States history. And what I have found in doing that activity is that very few kids will actually draw the right bubble. This is the history of the United States, as shown on the GeoHistogram. It's about, on the screen that I have, it's about the size of my thumbnail, of a fingernail, and so it's very, very, very small. Especially when you then pull open, the 12 major empires throughout history. And you look at these, and you can see Americas, not very big for the United States. You can see something else crept up in the Americas, and there's a layer that we can turn on to get those names. You can see that that's the Inca. And when you keep these names up, another thing that I love to recognize is, again, we're looking at time and space in one graph. So Europe has existed throughout time. But in terms of like Europe and an empire, Europe, you can see here, is in its colonial phase. And there's a point where Europe stretches all the way from the Americas to Oceania. They had a presence everywhere in the world. So if you want to talk about imperialism, if you want to talk about empires, the GeoHistogram is a great way to sort of showcase things. So we like to think in the 7th grade course of Rome as like the big hitter. And they're definitely a big hitter. You can look at the size of the oval here and you can see that it's spread out across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. But it didn't make it any further. Whereas later on in history, beyond the US or beyond the ancient world history course, when you get into high school, we will have units on Europe and imperialism. And you can see Europe very, very much an empire. It stretched from all the way across the world. Anywhere that there's a landmass, Europe had a presence, pretty much. So you can also look at Egypt. Egypt had a very long run as an empire, or as a major civilization, I should say. But it was primarily confined to a small portion in Africa. So you can see the bubble for Egypt stretches up throughout time, but it didn't have as wide a reach. It didn't even go all the way across the African continent. It was really confined geographically to its own little area. You can see that Greece may have actually been comparable in terms of reach to Rome during its empire phase or during its imperialistic phase, but it definitely did not last as long as Rome did up here. Whereas you could see something comparable to Rome on this particular map might be Arabian empires and how far that they stretched, or even the Mongols. Again, if you get further into history of the world. So the 12 major empires with their names is great, but there's also 20 empires that you can bring up to get a little bit more granular. So when I bring these names up, some of the additional ones that creep up, before the Inca, we had the Maya, and the Maya you can compare. We don't often spend quite as much time on what's happening in South America as we do as what's happening in Europe and Africa and the Middle East in the ancient world history course. You can see the Maya had a empire that lasted almost as long as Egypt, and it had about the same amount of reach across that South American continent. And then you have the Inca, and then of course the little thumbnail up here is the United States. So in the grand history of things, if you like to talk American exceptionalism, you'll be a little disappointed to note that we may be exceptional, but we have not been around for very long compared to some of the other empires. So that's a activity, and you can see I did that in about 5 minutes. If I clear the GeoHistogram and just go back to the timeline, there will be times when you'll be asked to bring up the GeoHistogram and turn on just a very specific layer and have kids, identify what they note. So here's Alexander the Great, and here's his reach. And if I were to go and turn Rome on, you can see there's Rome, there's Alexander, but Alexander's reach was very far. I also like to turn on Egypt to point out that Egypt may have been an empire during this era. It may have been at the peak of its civilization, but Egypt hasn't gone anywhere. You can see, Egypt has been a pretty consistent force throughout all of history. If I do European imperialism, this is a much more specific bubble that shows where where Europeans were settling and where most of their attention was throughout a good chunk of the world. And then if I turn that off for a second and I go to regional bridges, these are big events or people, more likely, that also appeared throughout space and time. So again, if you think of it like a timeline and then think of it like a map because it has east and west, the GeoHistogram simply serves as a tool for really showcasing in one graphic both the reach of space and time in one graphic. So you can have fun just turning layers on and asking kids to notice or make predictions of what they see. We have GeoHistogram activities built into every unit at some point in time. And so while it does look scary to start, it's really just about getting kids to envision place, space, and time all together in one graphic. So hopefully this helps. There's a ton of short burst, and by short burst I mean no more than 5 to 10 minute activities throughout the 7th grade Giants units that make use of the GeoHistogram, and really it's just about visualization for kids.